The aftermath of my mom's second emergency craniotomy, which was necessary to relieve a rapidly refilling subdural hematoma, was rocky to say the least. In the immediate days following the procedure, she was withdrawn and not communicative at all. Then she started to become a little bit more with it, but she was refusing to eat and drink anything, so she needed a nasogastric intubation placed, aka a feeding tube. And then in the moments that I included for August 18th and 19th in my book, Losing Linda May, a Cancer Caregiving Memoir, you start to see her mood really sour again. But it's different than before. She's not necessarily withdrawn, she's just really discouraged. This became abundantly clear when an occupational therapist named Claire came into work with my mom and started off by giving her an exercise where she had to memorize a whole paper of clip art, and then she asked my mom a memory from the day, and then she gave her this mental math equation where she had to count backwards from 100 in increments of 7, and then she had to recall whatever she could remember from that paper of clip art. So it was a lot of challenging things to do for a normal person, much less someone who had just had 2 craniotomies back to back. In a way, it kind of felt like Claire was setting my mom up to fail, but it wasn't being done with any malicious intent. She really was just trying to gauge where my mom's head was at, both figuratively and literally. I'm going to read the ending of this moment from my book. Mom refuses to make eye contact with the therapist. I compensate for her dismissiveness by saying, "Thank you, see you then." "You're more than welcome." Claire stands and leaves the room. "Why would you thank her?" Mom says, seething. "She made me feel like an idiot." "Considering you had 2 brain surgeries in a week," I say, approaching the bed, "I think you did a pretty damn good job." "She was incredibly rude." Claire could not have been more pleasant. "You just don't like getting things wrong, do you?" "Of course not." "See? You're discouraged. I get that. I would be too, but that doesn't mean she wasn't nice." "Whose side are you on?" "The one where you get better, which means doing these kinds of therapy." "I don't think making me feel dumb is very therapeutic." "That was probably just the evaluation. I imagine she'll bring in actual exercises when she comes tomorrow. That's if I agree to work with her." Mom references the power of the patient to refuse the service of any provider. "You're all talk," I say, rolling my eyes. "You're too polite to turn someone away." "Just you wait and see," she says indignantly. I think this experience really forced my mom to reckon with the limits of her current functionality, and that really kicked off the downward spiral of her mental state that unfolded in the subsequent days, to the point where we didn't even know if she wanted to keep living anymore because she was so unresponsive and withdrawn. And I think it was a combination of another setback prolonging her ability to recover, prolonging her hospital stay, and the question mark of if that is just going to keep happening in perpetuity and if she will ever even be able to get onto the road to recovery. And then it's also the question of, will I ever get back to my pre-cancer normal self? And what will it take to get to that point? Like, how much effort and energy am I going to have to exert to restore my functionality, to get back to that point where I can memorize a sheet of paper of clip art and recite that to a person, or to do mental math again? Like, it just, I think, felt really insurmountable after all my mom had been through. And of course, she just ended up into this depressive state. Throughout the course of my treatment for Hodgkin lymphoma, I never experienced this type of physical trauma. I didn't ever have limited mobility due to the treatments that I was undergoing. But I did have a series of events that resulted in a similar level of discouragement because I just had so many question marks about what was going to come next and when I could proceed with treatment because of a discovery that was made in my lungs. In November of 2020, when I had been diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma, during the scans that I had done through that entire process, they found that there was something in the lower right lobe of my lung that didn't really make sense for the type of cancer that I had. Before I could start chemotherapy, I had to see an infectious disease specialist because they had to rule out that it wasn't something like dormant tuberculosis that, if I got really immunocompromised, would kick up and then I would just start vomiting blood everywhere. So I did all this blood work, and it was based on every single place I had visited in the world up until that point because there are so many regional diseases. And then I also had to do a fine needle aspiration that was done through my back to reach the spot in my lung. Thankfully, my lung did not collapse. The results were inconclusive, so they allowed me to continue with treatment, though over the course of my R-CHOP regimen, which spanned 6 months and I had infusions every 2 weeks, the spot kept growing. which was alarming to me, though they just kind of felt like it was a granuloma and it was just something benign and it wasn't anything to worry about. I finished a regimen. I'm told that I'm in remission, but I relapsed a couple months later and then I had to start more aggressive inpatient chemotherapy, a regimen called AUG. After 2 rounds, I have a PET scan to see how the treatment is working against the cancer. It's doing a great job. Great. However, my severely immunocompromised state is allowing whatever is happening in my right lung to flourish. It's blowing up. Something is terribly wrong there. That's when they started to think that it was a fungi. And if fungi starts spreading enough and gets into the blood, it can get into the brain and then you can die. So it was incredibly alarming. That's why they had to halt all my treatments until they figured out exactly what was going on in my lung. And to do that, I had to do a bronchoscopy, which is a type of biopsy where they go through your trachea and then into your bronchi and then take a sample. It's much more accurate than a fine needle aspiration when you're going from the exterior of the body in puncturing the lung. The problem is that procedure is really specialized and there are very few places that actually do it. And we were still in the middle of a pandemic, so there were a lot of people who had lung issues that needed to be biopsied. So the wait list was, needless to say, very long. It took me about 2 months from when they first discovered this issue on the scan to when I actually had the bronchoscopy to have it done. And when I finally got the results, it confirmed that it was in fact a fungus. It's called cocci. I'm not even going to bother saying the full name because it is absolutely impossible. It's also known as valley fever, so it's a California thing. When most people breathe in fungal spores, their immune system can just get rid of it. At most, they'll get a fever, hence the name valley fever, but that's about it. However, my immune system was so depleted that when I breathed in fungal spores, they nestled into my lung and rooted in there and started proliferating. And then as I went through chemotherapy, my immune system was even more so depleted, so they started proliferating and replicating and growing. And that is why when I did the IGEV and I had absolutely no immune system, it just blew up even more. So I could not proceed on IGEV anymore. That was no longer an option for me. I could not get to that depleted state because it was such a risk factor. But before I could resume any type of treatment, they had to make sure that the fungus could be controllable through a prescription medication. So I had to do a full month's worth of this drug called posaconazole and then do another bronchoscopy and do a scan and see if it was moving the needle with the fungus and keeping it at bay. All this is to say, I was in a holding pattern for several months where I did not know if I would ever even be able to resume chemotherapy treatments again, or if I could have an autologous stem cell transplant in the future, because I could not do either of those things if I had this fungus that was not responsive to prescription drugs. And if it didn't respond to the prescription drugs, I most likely would have had to go onto an immunotherapy cocktail that would just keep the Hodgkin lymphoma at bay, and I would have to live with cancer instead of ever getting a permanent remission. All the setbacks and the waiting and the uncertainty just bared down on me, and I was in such a terrible state where I was living to just go to sleep. I would wake up in the morning, I would log on to work. All I would think about through the day is when I could go to sleep. I did not want to be dealing with this bullshit that I was going through. I didn't want to be interacting with people. I was a curmudgeon. I would joke nonstop at that time that I just wish that the cancer would just kill me already. I was just so depleted and I hated life. I hated what it was putting me through. So in that way, I now get where my mom's head was at. She just had no path forward. Nothing was clear to her. She didn't know when she was going to leave the hospital. She didn't know if she would ever recover. She didn't know if the treatment was going to work. It was just all so murky. While we had very different experiences, I understand now how horrible that can feel. So if you ever are a caregiver for a loved one who is in this depleted mental state during a medical crisis just due to all these terrible setbacks and they're feeling so discouraged, don't surround them with toxic positivity. Don't tell them all these false promises about what's going to happen next because you have no idea either. Just listen to them. Validate what they're feeling and honor the fact that they are suffering in that moment, but you will always be there to support them and will be beside them as they navigate whatever is coming next. That's all you can do. In the next video I'll be releasing on August 20th, I'll be talking about how time seems to stretch when you're in the most acute part of a medical crisis. So hit subscribe, leave any questions in the comments. The link to my book is in the description, and I will see you all then.